There we go. Welcome back to the Reality Show Life Coach podcast. Today we're going to be talking about season 45, episode 6 of Survivor. And with me today, I have a very special guest, Prerika Agarwal. Prerika, why don't you introduce yourself?
Lynn, first of all, thank you so much for having me on this show. I am Prerika, and I am a career and leadership coach for women and people of color. And my focus is helping you figure out what is your limiting belief, what is preventing you from creating those big, beautiful goals, and working with you on those.
Which is an amazing niche because I think it's so needed, especially like post pandemic, of like everybody kind of reevaluating and seeing what they want out of life. So I love that you serve that population of people.
Thank you.
So I'm going to do a quick show recap. A lot happened on this episode of Survivor. We start out, everybody's on the beach, and they find out that in 10 minutes from now, a boat's going to come pick them up, so they better find their stuff. So Bruce had just found a beware advantage, and now he's got to scramble to find this idol before the boat picks him up. I was shocked that he actually found it, but he did. Um, they take them to the Reba Beach where I thought they would be merged, but they're actually in limbo because they have to earn the merge, and maybe we'll talk about that today. But then they get dropped into this immunity challenge, which is possibly the most challenging immunity challenge I've ever seen. There's like every aspect of a survivor challenge you could possibly imagine went into this. Super intense. Half of the group then, or everybody ends up going to tribal, but only half of them, the ones who lost that challenge, are on the chopping block. The other group gets like amazing food, sanctuary, all those things. And then at the final tribal council, Caleb, they have this, special advantage these days called shot in the dark, where you have a one-time chance at just basically getting safe. It's not an actual idol. Like Jeff pulls something out and says if you're safe or not safe. And Caleb plays this, and this is the first time this advantage has ever been played successfully, wherein everybody unanimously voted Caleb to go home. He plays his shot in the dark, and he is safe. So instead, Jay goes home, and then the tribes merge. So, Prerika, what did you think of this episode?
So, in general, like we were talking about a little bit beforehand, Lynn, I just think Survivor as a show, it's such a great metaphor for sometimes what is going on in our mind, right? And I think what's interesting about this episode is that, they're so close, right? They're so close to getting what they want. The boats coming in, they feel like, all right, this is it. But then they find out, okay, there's all these other hurdles in between, actually, and it's not going to be within reach. And so I find that very interesting because I'm just thinking about all the times that we have goals as people, as human beings, and we think, okay, I'm going to close the deal, or I'm going to get the job, or I am going to, get into the relationship. But then you have all of these other things that happen in between, and how our mind has to switch focus all of a sudden from like celebrating and I think being complacent a little bit, right? And satisfied to,
Mm-hmm.
oh, wait a second, there's a lot of different things I need to work on. So in general, I just love those, nuggets from the show. And that's what I got from this episode in particular.
Yeah, it's almost like life in extreme because you're absolutely right. Like when something comes up, it's like, okay, I'm going to go for that thing. It seems like it should be a linear path. Like, oh, I just go from point A to point B and it's awesome. But, it's like we see on this show, it's like this wild ride. It's like anything could happen. So here they might have been thinking, like, okay, we'll rest on the beach for the day and then maybe later we'll have an immunity challenge. And then total plot twist where the boats show up. And so it's like they're getting what they want. It's just totally out of their control how it actually happens. And you see, I think at this point in the game, everyone's super adaptable. So nobody's like freaking out over it this, but at the same time, they all know their lives are going to completely change within a matter of minutes.
Yeah, I think that is so interesting, right? What you're saying is that they're in that mindset of being flexible, which I think is so important. So, yes, they're sort of like ready to go and take the thing and then get on the boat. But at the same time, they have the practice of being agile. And I
Mhm.
think that's something that, I would love for anyone listening to the show to take away is how can you practice that? It's almost like you're expecting the unexpected, right? So, not from a place of fear and not from a place of lack, right? You know you're going to get to your goals, but saying, like, okay, if things are thrown at your way, are you able to think about it in the moment and think about your new plan and think about what you need to do and are you able to prioritize? Because you will have a couple of different options, right, to get from point A to point B. And are you able to prioritize based on what you're good at, your strengths, right? What your needs are, and then figure it out. So I really like that point about this.
Yeah, and I think what you had said before about, I think you had mentioned the word complacency. It is interesting to see how like everybody's kind of poised in the show to like something's gonna happen. I am ready, and like if you compare that to day to day life, it's very easy to get complacent and not be in that ready position. Like, and ready meaning like I am scanning to see like what could be out there for me, opportunities or relationships or something like that. And so I think that like I don't know, that sparked something for me when you had said that because it is sort of a different state of mind when you're like open and receptive to something might happen soon and I'm ready for it, or I might create something and it might happen soon versus being in like a resting state where you're like, yep, I just go to work, do my work, come home, sit on the couch. And it's such a, I don't know, it's a different way to be.
Absolutely. And I think you're so right. I think, Lynn, that's probably a lot of the appeal of the show as well. What makes it exciting is for us on a day to day, it's a lot of routine, right? Most of us are doing the same things over and over again. There aren't a lot of these challenges, I think, that are affecting our immediate, what I call foundational needs, right? So affecting our food, sleep, shelter, water, like those things are covered and so for the most part, it's the same all the time. And so I think that's why people really like the show is that it's so raw in nature because people have to now think about, okay, what would happen if I didn't have those basic foundational things met? And what does that mean for me in terms of, getting to my goals and the other thing is who do I want to be while getting there? So I like that. I think in this episode, it's also interesting to see like how people's personalities come out, right? That maybe it's desperation, maybe the grudges you mentioned before. So I think it's like, how do those things come out when you are faced with a challenge?
Yeah. Well, I think it's like a double-edged sword on this show too, because you could do something that's incredibly clever. Like, when Bruce was looking for his idol, Jake is like, okay, I've got your back. He like suddenly is like, oh, I lost my ring. And he pretends like he lost his ring. So they had, a reason to be digging in the sand. And so in that moment, that was one of Jake's strengths. Like on the fly, he impromptu was like, hey, here's a strategy here. Um, that serves him really well, right? That last minute, I can help you out here, buddy. But then also on the show, that doesn't necessarily may not serve him in the future because then they're like, wow, Jake is really smart. He can think on the fly. And so maybe that doesn't necessarily like mirror everyday life wherein like a strength can become a weakness later, but maybe it can actually. I mean, a strength overused can become a weakness, but I just think that's interesting in this show that you always have to be thinking about if I'm showing up in this particular way that saves the day, somebody's also thinking that that is a way that I might win over them and they might use it against you in the future.
I think that is such an interesting point that you're bringing up, right? Because I think that your strengths can become a weakness if people use them against you, right? So I'm just thinking about the corporate world and leadership. And absolutely, I think if you have a strength that is unique and that other people don't have, let's say in your peer group, or even those who are, above you in terms of leadership, that can be threatening, right? So I think that's the main word is that threat of, hey, this person can use that to win. And so in on the show, it's about winning the show. But even I think in the court, if we think about the corporate ladder, people are thinking, hey, there's only so many spots at the top. And how do I eliminate the competition. And I think the people who think like that, right, they don't end up doing really well because it is a survival of the fittest type of mindset. Whereas if we think about it more holistically and say, like, I have a strength that is different from your strength. How do we combine these and create some type of synergy and momentum? That would be entirely different. And that would move our teams forward and be such a productive way to look at things. But I think that people have this raw, innate programming that leads them to feel competitive like they do on the show. And it comes out when those threats happen. And so, if the threat is only one person is going to get promoted, I think the same behavior sort of comes out, Lynn. So, I think you're absolutely right with that thread that you picked up.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point too, is like, and maybe like, how do you help people like this in coaching, right? Because it's like they might have this amazing strength that is unique to them that could be perceived as a threat to somebody if they were going for a promotion. So it's like, how do they continue to display that strength and not get protective about it? Because there could be the tendency to be like, oh, okay, I should play a little bit smaller here. I'm getting the feedback this is maybe a threat to somebody else or they don't like it. Like, how do you help somebody in those situations?
Ooh, this is getting very, very interesting and juicy now. So I think this is something that comes up a lot for the clients that I have. And there's the short-term decision of, okay, how do I work with this, knowing what the response is like on my leadership team in this role, in this organization? But ultimately, I urge my clients to think about it in the long term. Because if they are in an organization or a role where they feel like they have to downplay themselves and essentially dim their lights, right? That is not going to be the place that they want to stay long term because it's going to hinder their career and they aren't going to be able to shine and be the person that they are. And what happens is if you're not shining in the area that you're really strong in, you're going to try and shine in areas that are not your strength, and you'll try to come up with other personality traits or other qualities that you want to bring to the table, but you're not really as good at that. And so it starts becoming like the cycle where you don't really feel confident about it and you're not doing the right things. And so I would really urge those people to consider, can you fully step into your power? Is it something that's actually happening? Or is it a more of fear that you will not be taken seriously or you'll people will see you as a threat? And if it really is true that people are seeing you as a threat because you're shining your light, consider other options. Even though it feels like for us while we're in a job, maybe this is the only thing, we'll never find the same pay, we won't find this. There are so many different options where you can shine your light, and that is more important for your well-being in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, right? Because it's like if you're not being supported in those ways and you feel like you have to play small, it says a little bit more about the culture than it is about you, most likely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I mean, if you look at this episode, it's kind of a Caleb focused episode of the show. I mean, he is probably one of the most charismatic people I've seen in a super long time. Probably a benefit to any organization. I think he's in sales, and you can tell from his personality. Like, he is so charming and so likable and he's so out there. I mean, he gets to this point where he like definitely notices. Like I feel like he's an incredibly self-aware person. He's like, feel desperate. I know I'm on the chopping block. What do I do about this? But he's aware of it, so he's also like, okay, I've got to bring on a different side of my personality so it doesn't seem so needy and doesn't seem so desperate. Um, but at the same time, that skill of his within the game is exactly why everybody wrote him down at the end because they're like, oh no, this guy's way too good at this. Even in this moment of desperation, he's able to turn on the charm. And so it's kind of like, I don't know, it must be an interesting thing to be on the show because I'm sure that strength serves him so well in his day to day life. And then to try to adapt that to win, it's like, I don't know, it seems like it would be really hard to turn that side of your personality, like to dial it down, especially in those moments of desperation where the thing you're probably going to bring out the most is just your natural personality.
100%. I think what I find so interesting what you were sharing is it feels like Caleb is self-aware, right? So I think a lot of times with coaching, people don't completely understand all the weaknesses that they have or limitations. And so they're not able to, like you said, dial things up or down. But in this case, you mentioned him being really hyper aware of like that desperation that he's feeling. And so trying to dial that down. And then also knowing that he's a salesperson. And I think it's again, to use your words, it's a double-edged sword, Lynn, because people also know that you're adaptable, right? And you can, if you're self-aware and you can dial things up and down. But I think if people know that you're that flexible and you're like a chameleon, it makes them trust you less in general. So, yes, I think that for you, it can be very good because you're able to recognize and shift and change what you need to do. But because everybody else can't do that, and it's not a common trait of people to have that level of self awareness, that in itself, I think, is the threat that you're adaptable and you can change and kind of move quickly. And then I think to top it off, like you said, that sales type of behavior, I think in general, people are weary of salespeople and being sold to, and that, stereotype of like the slippery, slick salesman. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, because I was, like, thinking about, I'm like, what could he have done differently? And I don't even know because he's just himself out there. He's aware of what's going on. But yeah, I think, there's several people on this show who have masked what their careers are because of how they might be perceived. Most of them were lawyers or attorneys. Caleb doesn't try to hide that, but I also wonder like how different it would have been if he had gone on there and been like, "Oh, I'm like, a student," or, in a non-threatening or like a role that wouldn't be seen as being strategic on the show. I wonder if it would be any different, but he's still himself and he's still, like, putting himself out there with everyone. But, yeah, it does make him seem it's not even slimy, he's such a likable guy, but that's just, like, the exact reason where it's just like, "Oh gosh," and then put him on physical challenges, and he is gonna be like dynamite. So I'll be curious to see what happens for him in future weeks because he saved himself this week, but it's very clear that if it's a unanimous vote, even the people that he has alliances with, like Emily, like she if even one person had voted for Jay, then, like they wouldn't have, or, like anybody else besides Caleb, that person would have gone home. So it's like Emily also voted for Caleb and she was supposed to be like one of his closest alliances. So I don't know. I wonder what's going to happen in the future.
Yes, that's so interesting for sure because I don't think that people always vote against their competition. It's a little bit more complex than that, right? I think that in this case it's like yes, he's likable, but at the same time if people know that he's adaptable and he has like awareness about his limitations, I think again that seems like it could be a bigger threat. So, I'm curious to see as well.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the other things that stood out in this episode is just this transition from being like group mentality and thinking about things as a group to, okay, now we have merged and now it's this individual game. But in the meantime, we're in this limbo state where we're sort of in a group, we're sort of not. And I wonder, like, what is the mental process that people go through when it is like that? And I think about like my own experience going from working in a company to being a solopreneur. I don't know that it's necessarily the same thing, but it was like a massive shift to go from thinking about like, okay, what are my colleagues doing? What does my boss need? What does this need to individual? And I wonder, like, do you have experience with that yourself? And I know you probably see that a lot with your clients.
Yeah, I think that this is a very interesting dynamic to navigate in the corporate world. So, what I've seen is that it really varies by organization. And, some organizations have this culture of, we want to know exactly what you did specifically and what results you've created. And of course, you're never working in silo because you're part of this organization and company, but it's more about what the company culture is like. right? And then there are some organizations where you never use the word I. It's like a bad word to say. Everything is we and everything is my team and this. And I think that this is incredibly tough to navigate because it's all about trade-offs at the same time. And so, again, going back to the show, it's sort of like you can bring the whole team along with you, but then you're bringing along all of those strengths that the people have that are different strengths, but you're bringing all the weaknesses. And so I think you can actually go faster alone, but it's going to be a more lonely and difficult journey. And it's balancing those things of having the company and doing things together. And maybe you have some diversity of ideation, but it's going to take you longer, right, to do it because you have so many differing opinions. Or you've got that individualistic mentality, which is like, I know I'm trusting in myself and I'm going to move forward quickly. It's just, it's going to be a very lonely journey. So I think it's, I don't even have a full answer for that, but I think it's about flexing in the moment, is what I would say, in your own life and in the corporate world, and understanding that at times you need to be that single contributor, and at times it has to be about the team, and you don't want to be doing too much of one or the other.
Yeah.
So,
But how do you suss out like what's appropriate and when? Because it could even like vary from project to project if you worked at a place. And like here in Survivor, it definitely varies from conversation to conversation. Um, obviously a different situation because you can't trust everybody on Survivor. You probably are able to trust people at work a little bit more, but like, how do you suss that out?
So I like to think of it as, if you're doing something more strategic, and this is really if you're in a leadership role, if you're doing something more strategic, right, that requires one important decision, or it is about the vision or direction in which you're going, that is a time where you as a leader want to step in and say, I'm going to trust my instinct and I am the deciding factor. But when it's more about the doing and the delivery, right? So if we go back to the show, if they're saying, are we going to pitch a tent versus, let's say, find, a cave to rest in for the night, the leader is going to make that decision. And then the team is going to be the one that is either building that tent or finding the cave. And so I think that's the differentiating thing, and you have to understand where you are, honestly, in the hierarchy of your organization, right? Are you truly at that leadership level where you're leading and directing people, and your job is to keep people focused and you're deciding the vision and setting that and setting the course of things? Or are you more in an environment where you are delivering things and that piece of you is required? So I think it's, again, understanding the hierarchy and then understanding the politics again of the organization. Because again, in some organizations, no matter what level you sit at, you're going to be expected to be the doer, right? And only one person at the top is going to be setting the vision and everybody else is going to be in doing mode. So again, I think it's understanding your hierarchy of where you fall and the culture, and that's going to help you a lot. And then the third way I would say, which is a little bit more painful for most people, is observing the feedback that you're receiving from people. So real-time feedback in terms of how are people reacting to what you're doing and saying, facial expressions, comments, all of that. And then more formal performance related feedback. And that those will all be indicators of, what do you want to be doing?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's interesting too, is like when you're a part of a we, you can, I don't want to say hide a little bit, but you're definitely not like targeted versus in the leadership role. And so there's like that certain element of bravery to step out in front of everyone and be in that space because you are noticed more and you can't
Yes.
hide. And like you see that on here, it's like as you go along in the show, the fewer people that are there, the less you can hide. And it comes out. But it is interesting how like certain people on the show seem to want to be leaders, and you have people like Caleb, like Bruce, who want to step out in front, but it like their names come up more often. But it can also come with a lot more rewards too, because it's like if they make it all the way to the end, then it's like they might win the $1 million. So I don't know. I mean, it's But, like, how do you navigate the space if, these quote unquote like flat organizations where it's just like, no, no, we all sit in the same room, there's no hierarchy. Um, which is
If there's
sometimes happen on Survivor, right? There's no hierarchy here. We're all in this together, but it's hard to know what to
yes.
do.
I think, and again, if it's, if it's that type of situation, you're so right. The fewer people there are, the flatter it is, the more you're going to stand out. And I think will you be okay with that? Because I think one of the things that people fail to realize about leadership or making these type of decisions are you're probably going to be wrong a lot, right? I like to say it's probably 50-50. If you're doing something that's new, that's uncharted territory, right, that you've never done before, your organization has never done before, you will probably be wrong. And are you okay sticking your hand, your head out or putting your hand up and volunteering something or suggesting something that is not going to be the right way, knowing that yes, people will see you as brave and courageous, but they're also going to be seeing you as somebody who, you know, um, wasn't right and who made the wrong decision. And so, like, do you have that in you? Are you willing to risk that and be okay with that? So, I think that's another key question to ask yourself is, are you willing to be that person? And so, let's say, even if there is hierarchy and you are one of the doers, and you do suggest something and you do have a direction that you want to take things in, know that you may very well be wrong, right? And are you okay with other people knowing that and realizing that about you? And are you able to go on? And for some people, they're not able to. And asking yourself, is it because you just don't have enough confidence? Is it because of years of experience? Is it maybe in that area you're not an expert, right? So asking yourself, like, where is that coming from? Because those are all factors as well, is the more experience that we have in something, even if it's not exactly that thing, but let's say in that industry or you've made difficult decisions, you get more and more confident in taking that risk and being wrong. Or you're also like a little bit more sure of, okay, these are probably things that we don't want to do because they're absolutely not going to work, right? And you have that experience as time goes on.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it's like what could seem like a right decision to some people could seem like wrong to others and like vice versa. So it's like this group of people might be like, well, that was the absolute wrong decision, whatever. Like, let's say the example is like scheduling or something. They could be like, this is terrible. We hate this. And then you get the other group of people who are like, this is amazing. And so I think that's what also makes it tough too. And we see this on the show all the time is that often there's no win-win. It's no like black and white, like here's the right, here's the wrong, and therefore like it's very neat and tidy. And I think that's what also makes it challenging is it's like that nuanced approach to it, and being okay with like, okay, you know what? 50% of the time it might be seen as the wrong call to people. And I have to keep like that big picture in mind. And maybe this is kind of what seems to be happening for everyone in the tribes is like, okay, big picture is we still have half of the show left to go to get to. And so, like, how can I make decisions today that might help me get to the end, not knowing if they're right or wrong and letting that
Yeah,
be okay?
you're so right. I mean, that is such a good point that sometimes it isn't black and white, like you said, and there's a lot of gray area. And even after you make the decision, right, people are still having thoughts about, is this correct? Is this not correct? So you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And I don't know. I've been in several leadership positions in the past, and that's I think the hardest thing. And I'm sure that's for you too. Um is having to make a call that you know is not going to be popular and yet doing it anyway because it's like the right thing to do. It serves the bigger mission of the organization. And yeah, and letting people maybe not be super happy with you in those moments, and that's okay.
Absolutely. I think that's the other call we have to make is not being liked, right? Making decisions and letting go of, I think, sometimes that people pleasing, which is so innate and which is such a big part of who we are. And I think it's a survival mechanism as well, right? And so you're so right. We have to let go of that sometimes and say, like, what is my mission? What am I trying to achieve? What's the vision and goal here? and knowing that you're probably going to ruffle a lot of feathers in the process.
Yep, absolutely. Well, and I think too is that like we don't leave ourselves at home too. And I think that's the part that I find to be fascinating on Survivor is like different emotions come into play and it's like the logical side of your brain might say, "Okay, I should go with this person." But there's also a part of you and we see this like more at the beginning of this episode where they just talk about holding grudges. Like Austin had the opportunity last week with two others, with Kelly, with Jay, to get sandwiches or an advantage. And he wanted the sandwiches. And it seems like such a small and petty thing. But on the show where everybody is starving, and it's a basic survival thing to have, sustenance and have food here. Like he is holding on to that. So it's even interesting to think about it from that point of view is like when we're making decisions or when we're guiding our path, it's like also impacted by not just what's in front of you in the moment, but all of these past things that have happened to us, maybe in relationship to that person or maybe just in our lives in general that reminds us of that moment. So I just thought that was interesting on here is that like from the outside's perspective, you're like, this is just a sandwich. Like, why would you possibly like let that impact your game? But to him, he's like, this is a really big deal. It comes up quite a bit, so much so that I'm like, is this going to play a part in the future of the show? Like these silly little sandwiches, because they've brought it up and they've highlighted it so much. It's just kind of fascinating.
And I think you're so right about the emotions, right? And how I think in this case it's that emotion is so strong that it is sort of anchoring us in a certain place. And so again, like you said, the logical brain is saying, "Hey, we have this option in front of us. This is the goal. This is what we want to do." But emotions can be so strong that they can leave us in a place in the past, even if we know that that is not for our highest good or it's not going to take us where we want to go. And I think that is part of coaching yourself or part of your self development is being able to just, I think, feel those feelings in the moment, process everything that you need to feel, know that you're not going to feel good all the time and you will be angry and upset and disappointed. But how do I like to think about anchoring into a future feeling, right? And so comparing like that grudge feeling of like what happened with the sandwiches to how am I going to feel once I'm like off the island, right? Once I'm in the boat, like what does that feel like? And start feeling that now, because otherwise you're feeling all of those past emotions and it's rarely productive.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think and I'd be curious to know what his experiences of watching this back of yeah, absolutely, like, him holding on to this isn't serving him. It might seem protective because it's like, "I have to remember these people have wronged me," it's not really, like, serving him. It's probably keeping him much more separate from those other people. The advantages that they have are contingent on the group of 3 of them being together, so it plays out in different ways as they move along in the show. So, him holding on to this may or may not serve him. So, we'll see what happens with that. Was there anything else from this episode that, like, stood out to you that was on your mind as you think back?
I think the only thing, and we touched on this before, so you'll let me know if I'm
Yeah.
repeating myself, but I think again, it's this concept that I think about of having our basic needs met. And so thinking about food, shelter, rest, and even our emotional needs met before we can get to a goal, right? And so this show is really focused on these people who don't have those needs met, right? And so it's very like the primal part of their brains, the primal part of their emotions. That is what's coming out and running the show. But I would say for all of us who are listening today, we have most of those needs met, right? And so when we are hit with things, a lot of times it feels like those basic needs are being taken away and there's a threat to that. And so for example, if somebody sends us a conflicting email or somebody says something to us or we don't get to what we want, it can feel like we don't have a place to sleep or we're going to go hungry for the night or whatever have you, right? And so I think it's again about training our brain to recognize actual threats because again, we're so hardwired to see us being in the state of nature and seeing everything coming at us as a threat because our basic needs are met. And so I would just encourage everybody, again, who's listening, focus on that when you do feel nervous about something or something is upsetting you, right? Really think about, is this something that's affecting my baseline needs? Or is this something that is preventing me from getting to my goal? Because that is the way that you're going to keep yourself moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's such a good point too, is that, like, getting that part taken care of, but also, like, differentiating. And if you notice that you're like, okay, I am super activated, the thing that's coming at me that seems like this huge threat, the conflicting email or something, if it's hard to, like, settle into yourself and calm around that, that's where, like, coaching can be super helpful, because you get this other person's perspective coming in that can just say, okay, let's slow this down. Let's help you regulate a little bit more. Let's help you look at this from a different perspective. Um, Maybe this isn't the threat that you think it is. If we break it down in just the facts of what's happening and how that's impacting you and how you're thinking about things. So, because sometimes we can get that email and make a rash decision to just respond, like, reactively in a way that doesn't help us if we're doing that. And so yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's almost like we're seeing the extreme version on this show, like all of these things happening to them, that a lot of them do seem like threats. There were a lot of snakes in this episode too, which I guess they're not seeing as threats, but I would have absolutely. Because it's like it's being able to just take that step back and getting a different perspective on it. Is this an actual threat, or is this my mind thinking it is a threat?
Absolutely. And the snakes just made me laugh because I think, again, it's like that metaphorical. So many of us have those metaphorical snakes.
Yeah.
And I would agree. I mean, most people don't tend to like snakes, but it's how bothered are we by them,
Mhm.
right? And how scared are we? How nervous are we about the snake and how is it affecting our life and what we're trying to do? And so I think that's a very, very interesting point as well.
Nobody was freaked out by it, which leads me to believe that A, they're not afraid of snakes. B, they've seen so many snakes that they have trained themselves to just not be surprised anymore. It just goes to show the things that, like, sometimes we can think are the scariest when you're just exposed to them or you change your relationship to them. It's like, wow, this is no longer impacting my life in the way that it used to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I have to ask as a last question, would you go on Survivor? Yes or no?
Oh my gosh, definitely not. I don't think I would make it like an hour on that show. I have never even been camping, so I don't think I would last on that show. So I would not want to go.
I love that completely honest answer. I mean, I think it's good to know this about ourselves, of like, would I do it? Yes or no? Yeah, it's like my thing is definitely the physical challenges. I'm always watching those and going, "Oh, oh boy. I like walking. I like things not moving underneath my feet or swinging at my face." That's where I come from. Um, any last thoughts before we wrap up today?
No, this was so fun, Lynn. Thank you so much for having me on the show. And it was great talking to you.
Yeah, likewise. If somebody wanted to find you, where would they go looking?
Sure. So if somebody wants to get in touch with me, they can go to inspirationcareers.com.
Excellent. And I'll have that in the show notes. Thanks again for coming on. It was such a pleasure.
It was great. Thank you. Bye.